They say freedom was not born in a single moment, but in the slow awakening of human conscience. And nowhere did that awakening shine brighter or more imperfectly than in a rocky city by the Aegean Sea, where citizens first learned to rule themselves. This is the story of how democracy, an idea that would one day change the world, was born in ancient Athens. Hello, and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. Long before the word democracy was spoken, power in the ancient world belonged to kings, priests, and warriors. In Mesopotamia, pharaohs ruled as gods. In Persia, the great king's word was law. And even in early Greece, city-states were governed by nobles born into privilege. Yet something different was stirring in Athens: a restlessness, a hunger for equality, a desire for the many to have a voice rather than the few. To understand why Athens became the cradle of democracy, we must first look at its world. The Greek mainland was not one great empire, but a scatter of independent city-states, polis, each with its own government, army, and customs. Sparta, fierce and disciplined, built its power on military obedience. Corinth thrived through trade. But Athens, perched on the Attic Peninsula, found its destiny in debate, intellect, and civic pride. The city's early rulers were aristocrats, wealthy landowners who claimed noble lineage and held the reins of justice. Ordinary citizens, mostly farmers and craftsmen, lived under their shadow, often in debt to those who controlled the land. Many small farmers borrowed seed or tools from the rich, pledging their fields or even their freedom as collateral. When harvests failed, they lost everything. Some Athenians were sold into slavery by their creditors. The city was on the edge of collapse, not from foreign invasion, but from its own inequality. Then came a man named Solon, born around 640 BCE, a poet, lawgiver, and reformer whose words could both soothe and sting. When the city teetered between tyranny and revolt, the Athenians turned to him, asking him to bring order without bloodshed. Solon accepted, but on one condition: that both sides, rich and poor, would trust him to act in fairness. Solon's reforms became one of the first great steps toward democracy. He canceled debts that enslaved the poor, declaring that no Athenian shall live in bondage. He freed those sold abroad and forbade future loans secured on human freedom. His seisakteia, or shaking off of burdens, restored dignity to thousands. But Solon did more than relieve suffering. He restructured society itself. He divided citizens into 4 classes based on wealth, not birth. The richest could hold high office and command armies. The poorer classes could still vote in the assembly and serve on juries. This broke the monopoly of noble power and gave the lower classes a foothold in governance. For the first time, political rights were linked to contribution rather than ancestry, a revolutionary idea for its time. Solon also reformed the ecclesia, the assembly of citizens, and established the Helieia, a people's court that allowed ordinary men to challenge the decisions of officials. Justice was no longer the privilege of the few. It became a matter of public debate. But Solon to dream was fragile. After he departed from Athens, perhaps to avoid being pressured by either side, the city descended again into turmoil. Ambitious leaders vied for power. Among them was Pisistratus, a charismatic noble who seized control and ruled as a tyrant. Yet the Greek word tyrannos then did not carry the same evil tone it holds today. Pisistratus was not cruel. In fact, his rule brought stability, prosperity, and even culture. He supported the arts, encouraged festivals, and beautified Athens. Under him, the Panathenaic festival flourished, honoring Athena, the city's guardian goddess. Poetry, sculpture, and drama thrived. Athens grew rich from trade and tribute. Still, tyranny was tyranny, even if benevolent. Power remained concentrated in one man's hands. When Pisistratus died, his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, inherited the rule, but they lacked their father's grace. Corruption crept in, and suspicion turned into repression. After Hipparchus was slain in a private dispute, Hippias became paranoid and cruel. It was this tyranny that finally provoked the Athenians to reclaim their freedom. Two noblemen, Cleisthenes and Isagoras, became rivals for power. Isagoras sought Spartan help, inviting the foreign king to impose order by force. Cleisthenes, in contrast, turned to the people. He promised them a new order, one where citizens would no longer be divided by family or wealth, by community and shared responsibility. The Athenians rose against Isagoras and his Spartan allies, driving them out. Cleisthenes emerged as leader, but instead of ruling as a tyrant, he gave the people something no one else had dared: true political power. Around 508 BCE, Cleisthenes enacted reforms that transformed Athens into the first known democracy in history. He reorganized the population into 10 tribes, each made up of men from different regions, city, coast, and countryside, ensuring that no single faction could dominate. Each tribe elected 50 men to serve in a new council called the Boule, a body of 500 citizens who prepared laws for the assembly to debate. This was government by lot, ordinary men chosen by chance to serve, ensuring fairness and limiting corruption. In Cleisthenes' system, the ecclesia, the assembly of citizens, became the heart of power. Every free male citizen over 18 could attend, speak, and vote. They met on the Piniac Hill, overlooking the Acropolis, where voices echoed under the open sky. There, decisions were made on war, taxes, laws, and treaties, not by kings or generals, but by the people themselves. The word demokrateia was born, rule of the people. It was not perfect, of course. Women, slaves, and foreigners, nearly 2/3 of the population, were excluded. But for the citizens who gathered on that hillside, it was revolutionary. Power was no longer divine, inherited, or bought. It was shared. Imagine that scene. Thousands of citizens gathered in the sunlight, some farmers with dirt still on their hands, others merchants or soldiers, all raising their hands to vote. Their decisions shaped the fate of Athens. Each man's voice, once unheard, now carried the weight of the city's destiny. For the first time in recorded history, ordinary people governed themselves. This new democracy reshaped the Athenian spirit. Citizens felt pride not just in their lineage, but in their civic duty. To serve the polis was an honor, to neglect it a shame. Political life became a form of participation in the sacred. Temples, theaters, and marketplaces became arenas of discussion, art, and debate. The Athenians learned to speak, argue, persuade, and listen. From this ferment rose one of Athens' most remarkable inventions: public discourse. The art of rhetoric, the power of speech, became a vital skill. To persuade the assembly was to shape the future. Thus was born the Greek tradition of philosophy and reason. From the debates of citizens would later emerge thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who questioned not just politics but the nature of truth itself. Yet democracy was not without its enemies. Many elites saw it as dangerous, rule by the ignorant masses. Others feared instability, for every decision depended on the shifting mood of the crowd. And indeed, Athens' democracy would face constant tests from war, ambition, and the passions of its own people. One of those tests came with the rise of Persia, the greatest empire of its time. In 490 BCE, the Persian king Darius sent his armies to punish Athens for supporting rebels in Ionia. The Athenians, vastly outnumbered, met them on the plains of Marathon. There, 10,000 citizen soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, each fighting not for a king, but for their own freedom. Against all odds, they triumphed. The victory at Marathon became a legend, not only of courage, but of the power of free citizens united by choice, not command. The wars with Persia tested Athens' democracy, but also strengthened it. Under the leadership of Themistocles, the city built a navy of triremes, sleek wooden ships rowed by citizens who had gained power through their service. These men, once the poorest of the poor, became the backbone of Athens' defense. At Salamis, they defeated the Persian fleet and saved Greece.
Democracy had proven not just moral strength, but military might. In the decades that followed, Athens entered its golden age. The boule governed, the assembly ruled, and the courts thrived. Citizens served in rotation, paid for their time, so that even the poor could participate. Pericles, the great statesman, called Athens the school of Hellas, where every man could speak his mind and contribute to the common good. Under his guidance, the Parthenon rose above the city, gleaming in marble, a temple not only to Athena, but to human possibility. Yet Pericles' Athens was also a paradox. While the citizens debated liberty, thousands of slaves worked the silver mines and built the temples. While the assembly praised equality, women remained confined to the home, unseen in public life. Even so, the experiment endured and inspired. Democracy in Athens was not
The glory of Athens did not come quietly. It was built upon the roar of assembly debates, the clash of oars at sea, and the echo of ideals that the world had never seen before. Yet, for all its brilliance, Athenian democracy was fragile, a living thing, always at risk of being devoured by its own ambition. After the Persian Wars, Athens stood at the center of a new order. The Persian threat had united the Greek city-states, but victory also revealed Athens' growing power. The city formed an alliance called the Delian League, a coalition meant to protect Greece from future invasions. At first, it was a partnership of equals. Member states contributed ships or money stored in a treasury on the sacred island of Delos. But as Athens' influence grew, the League slowly became an empire in all but name. The Athenians, proud of their democracy, began to act like kings abroad. They transferred the League's treasury from Delos to Athens, claiming it was safer there. Soon, tribute from the allied cities funded not only defense, but also magnificent temples, theaters, and festivals. The Parthenon itself was built with money once meant for common security. While citizens at home enjoyed prosperity, many allies felt enslaved by Athenian dominance. The city that had overthrown tyrants now risked becoming a tyrant itself. Still, within Athens, democracy flourished. Under Pericles, who rose to prominence around 460 BCE, the system reached its most mature form. Pericles believed in the greatness of Athenian freedom and sought to make civic participation accessible to all. He introduced pay for public service, ensuring that even the poorest citizens could attend the assembly, serve as jurors, or hold office. No longer was politics the playground of the wealthy. It became the duty of every citizen. Pericles was not merely a politician, he was an orator of extraordinary vision. His speeches could stir the heart and sharpen the mind. He once said, "Our Constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a few, but of the many." Under his leadership, Athens became the cultural heart of Greece, the city of sculptors, dramatists, and philosophers. Theaters filled with the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the Agora buzzed with debate, the Acropolis gleamed under the Mediterranean sun. In those years, democracy was more than a political system, it was a way of life. Athenians were taught that freedom demanded participation, that to be absent from public affairs was to be useless. They believed that a citizen's worth lay not in what he owned, but in what he contributed to the polis. It was a radical idea, that responsibility was the price of liberty. But Athens' brilliance also cast deep shadows. Its democracy depended on the labor of others, on women confined to domestic life, on slaves who worked the mines, and on the empire's tributes. The very foundation of equality rested upon inequality. Yet, even with its contradictions, Athens had unlocked something profound, the belief that citizens could govern through reason rather than fear, through debate rather than decree. The heart of Athenian democracy was the ecclesia, the assembly of citizens that met on the Pnyx. There, anyone could step forward, raise his hand, and address the people. They debated everything from war to religion to the price of grain. Votes were taken by a show of hands or by secret ballots using stones. No king dictated the outcome, only the collective voice of the people.
Supporting the assembly was the boule, the council of 500 men chosen by lot each year. These citizens prepared the agenda, managed finances, and ensured that the machinery of democracy ran smoothly. Every day, a portion of the council met to handle state affairs, with new members rotated regularly. It was an ingenious design. By random selection, Athens prevented corruption and gave everyone a chance to serve. Justice, too, belonged to the people. The Heliaia, or People's Court, was the beating heart of Athenian law. Jurors, drawn by lot, numbered in the hundreds, ensuring that no single judge or official could control verdicts. Cases ranged from property disputes to treason, and speeches were made not by lawyers, but by the citizens themselves. In these courts, eloquence became power. A man's fate could hinge on his ability to move his peers with reason or emotion. Such openness made Athenian life dynamic, but also volatile. The same freedom that empowered citizens could turn into chaos when passion overtook reason. Demagogues, skilled orators who manipulated public opinion, rose to influence. Among them was Cleon, a fiery populist who demanded harsh measures against Athens' enemies and spoke to the crowd's anger rather than its wisdom. Democracy had given every man a voice, but it had not guaranteed that every voice would be wise. The tension between reason and passion, idealism and ambition would come to define Athens' fate. And nowhere was that tension more visible than in its rivalry with Sparta, the austere city-state that valued order, discipline, and obedience above all. For decades, Athens and Sparta had coexisted uneasily, two powers, two ways of life. One free and creative, the other rigid and controlled. It was perhaps inevitable that they would clash. The Peloponnesian War, which erupted in 431 BCE, was more than a struggle for dominance. It was a test of democracy itself. At the war's beginning, Pericles urged restraint. He believed Athens' strength lay in his navy and in patience. But after his death, the city's leadership fractured. Demagogues gained sway, calling for reckless offensives. The once disciplined democracy descended into factionalism and fear. War magnified the city's weaknesses. The plague struck Athens early in the conflict, killing thousands, including Pericles himself. The assembly, desperate for victory, made rash decisions. In 415 BCE, it launched the disastrous Sicilian expedition, a massive naval invasion meant to conquer new lands and resources. It ended in catastrophe, an entire fleet lost, tens of thousands dead or enslaved. The democracy had gambled everything on ambition, and the price was ruin. In the aftermath, chaos opened the door to tyranny once again. Oligarchs, known as the 400, seized power in 411 BCE, claiming that democracy was too unstable to survive. They ruled briefly before being overthrown by a popular uprising. But Athens' democracy, though restored, was never the same. Trust had eroded, fear lingered. When Sparta finally triumphed in 404 BCE, Athens lay defeated, stripped of its empire and glory. Sparta installed a puppet government, the infamous 30 tyrants, who ruled through terror and executions. Among their victims were hundreds of citizens, including political opponents and anyone suspected of supporting democracy. The experiment that began with Solon and Cleisthenes seemed to have ended in darkness. But the Athenian spirit, forged in freedom, refused to die. Within a year, a resistance led by democratic exiles retook the city. The tyrants were overthrown, and democracy was restored once more. This rebirth was more cautious, more measured, as if the city had learned from its own pain. The new system sought balance between liberty and order, between passion and justice. It was during this period that Socrates, the philosopher, walked the streets of Athens, questioning everything. He asked citizens to think not just about what democracy was, but whether they truly understood virtue, truth, and justice. To some, he was a gadfly, to others, a danger. In 399 BCE, he was tried and executed for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. His death remains one of history's great paradoxes. The city that birthed free thought condemned its greatest thinker. Yet Socrates' questioning spirit lived on through his Thuans, Plato and Aristotle, who wrestled with the meaning of democracy long after his death. Plato distrusted the system that had killed his teacher, fearing that democracy's freedom could turn to chaos when ignorance ruled. In his Republic, he imagined a state governed by philosopher kings, those guided by reason rather than desire. Aristotle, more pragmatic, saw democracy as one form among many, arguing that its success depends on balance and virtue. Their debates would shape political philosophy for millennia. Even in its decline, Athens remained the world's laboratory of ideas. By the 4th century BCE, Athens had lost its empire, but not its voice. Other powers, Sparta, Thebes, and eventually Macedonia, rose to dominance. Yet the ideals of citizenship, debate, and equality before the law endured. When Alexander the Great spread Greek culture across Asia, it was Athenian democracy, not Spartan discipline, that inspired the cities that followed. Centuries later, Rome would adopt and adapt those ideas. Its republic borrowed Athens' councils and assemblies, blending them with its own institutions. And when the Roman Empire fell, the memory of Athenian democracy lay dormant, like embers waiting to reignite. Thousands of years later, those embers would spark revolutions, from the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe to the founding fathers of the United States. Jefferson, Madison, and Adams studied the Athenian experiment, its triumphs and its failings, and built upon its lessons. Modern democracy was born not from perfection, but from the courage to keep trying, just as the Athenians once had. What Athens gave the world was not merely a political system, but a question that never fades. Who should rule, and how should they rule justly? Each generation answers differently, but the question remains the same. The people of Athens learned that democracy is not an end. It is a fragile balance between freedom and responsibility.
When we speak of democracy, we often imagine the clean ideals written in textbooks, the noble citizens gathered in sunlight, the wisdom of the people, the triumph of freedom. But in ancient Athens, democracy was not born in perfection. It was forged in argument, imperfection, and constant struggle. It was loud, messy, and deeply human. That is perhaps why it survived for so long, and why its lessons remain timeless. After the restoration of democracy in 403 BCE, Athens stood at a crossroads. The scars of war and tyranny were still fresh, and the people had to decide whether they would repeat the mistakes of the past or rebuild something wiser. The amnesty declared after the fall of the 30 tyrants was one of history's most remarkable acts of forgiveness. Instead of revenge, the Athenians chose reconciliation. Those who had supported the oligarchs were allowed to return and live in peace, as long as they swore loyalty to the new democratic order. It was a decision that stunned the ancient world, a reminder that mercy could be stronger than hate. This renewed democracy was not as radical as before. The Athenians had learned the cost of excess, the danger of passion unchecked by reason. They sought stability. The institutions were carefully balanced. The assembly, the courts, and the council all retained their powers, but reforms were introduced to ensure accountability. Written laws were reviewed more systematically. The city tried to guard itself against demagogues who might twist freedom into chaos. Still, Athens could never again return to its imperial glory. Its navy was gone, its allies lost, its wealth diminished. But even in decline, Athens remained the intellectual heart of Greece, a city of ideas rather than armies. Here, the descendants of those early citizens began to reflect deeply on what democracy truly meant. In the bustling agora, philosophers and rhetoricians debated beneath the open sky. The Stoics, who would later inspire Roman thinkers, were born from this environment of freedom and conversation. They believed that virtue and reason, not wealth or birth, defined a good life, a natural extension of democratic ideals. For them, every human being, regardless of class or nation, shared in reason and therefore in moral worth. From this, the seeds of human rights would one day grow. Public speaking became not just a tool of politics, but an art form. Men like Demosthenes, one of Athens' greatest orators, honed their voices to perfection, standing before crowds to defend liberty against foreign kings and domestic corruption.
Demosthenes himself fought to rouse Athens against the rising threat of Philip II of Macedon, warning that submission to monarchy would end the freedom their ancestors had died for. Nothing, he once said, is more important than freedom, not wealth, not comfort, not safety. His speeches, filled with urgency and conviction, captured the last great pulse of Athenian democracy before the storm that would end it. For while Athens spoke of liberty, power in Greece was shifting northward. In Macedonia, a kingdom once seen as barbaric by southern Greeks, Philip II was building an unstoppable force. He united the fractious Macedonian tribes, reformed the army, and set his eyes on the divided Greek city-states. He understood that while Athens was brilliant, it was also fractured, its democracy often slowed by endless debate and internal conflict. Philip's rise posed a question that haunted every Athenian. Could freedom survive in a world ruled by empire? When his armies moved south, some cities surrendered willingly. Others resisted and fell. Athens, though weakened, stood defiant, forging alliances in one last attempt to preserve independence. But at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Philip's forces crushed the allied Greek armies. Among the Macedonian soldiers that day was his young son, Alexander, who would soon be called the Great. Philip imposed a peace that ended Greek independence, though Athens retained some autonomy. The dream of democracy seemed to fade beneath the march of kings. Yet, even under Macedonian rule, Athens remained the beacon of intellect. When Alexander spread Greek culture across Asia, he carried with him not just armies, but ideas born in the Athenian agora. Ideas of reason, debate, and civic life. And so, paradoxically, the fall of Athens gave rise to its spirit. The Hellenistic world became a web of cities modeled on the Athenian polis, where citizens gathered in councils and assemblies. Even monarchs who ruled those cities claimed to govern for the people. The shadow of Athenian democracy stretched far beyond the Aegean. For centuries, philosophers, historians, and poets would look back at Athens as both an ideal and a warning. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the Peloponnesian War, wrote not to glorify Athens but to understand it. His words still ring with eerie relevance. It was not the walls that made Athens great, but the men who defended them. He saw how democracy's greatest strength, its reliance on human judgment, was also its weakness. When citizens acted with virtue, the system thrived. When they yielded to fear or greed, it collapsed. The Athenians themselves understood this fragility. They invented mechanisms to prevent tyranny from ever returning. One of the most fascinating was ostracism, a process by which the citizens could vote to exile anyone they believed posed a threat to the state. Each year, they wrote names on pottery shards, ostraca, and if one man's name appeared too often, he was banished for 10 years, without loss of property or honor. It was a democratic safeguard against ambition. Ironically, it could also be used politically, to silence rivals. Democracy's tools could defend or destroy, depending on who wielded them. Despite its decline, Athens never abandoned its commitment to civic participation. Festivals, theater competitions, and public rituals continued to bind the community together. The theater of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis became a mirror of democracy itself. There, playwrights like Euripides and Aristophanes explored questions of justice, power, and human folly. Through laughter and tragedy, Athenians examined their own society, their courage, hypocrisy, and hope. The stage was, in its own way, another form of the assembly. And, while men debated in public, the unseen hands of women sustained the life of the city. Though excluded from politics, Athenian women shaped culture through family, ritual, and religion. They were the keepers of domestic stability and the unseen educators of future citizens. In the mysteries of Eleusis, in the weaving of Athena's robe for the Panathenaic procession, they preserved traditions older than the city itself. Their silence was not absent, it was endurance. By the time Rome rose to power, Athens had become less a political force than a symbol. Roman generals who conquered Greece bowed before its culture. Cicero, the Roman orator, called Athens the home of eloquence, the mother of philosophy. Roman youths came to study in its schools, learning logic from Aristotle's successors and ethics from the Stoics. The democracy that had once been ridiculed by kings now educated their heirs. Even under Roman rule, Athens remained a free city, its institutions respected, if not entirely independent. The assembly still met, though its powers were symbolic. The laws of the empire governed now, not the decrees of citizens. Yet the spirit of participation survived, transformed into academic debate, civic rituals, and philosophical dialogue. Centuries later, when empires fell and kingdoms rose, the idea of Athenian democracy never truly vanished. Monks copied ancient texts, scholars whispered of the age when men governed themselves. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered the works of Aristotle and Plato, Athens came alive again in imagination. Artists painted its marble temples, thinkers dreamed of its freedom. The Enlightenment turned those dreams into revolutions. From the salons of Paris to the halls of Philadelphia, thinkers invoked Athens as proof that free men could govern without kings. "We are all Greeks," wrote the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, meaning not by blood, by the inheritance of reason and liberty. The founding fathers of America studied the Athenian assembly, seeking to learn from both its brilliance and its failures. They admired its courage, but tempered it with checks and balances, knowing but unchecked democracy could become tyranny by the majority. And yet, even with centuries of evolution, the core idea remains the same as it was on that hill in Athens, that ordinary people, guided by reason and shared purpose, can govern themselves. That freedom is not bestowed, it is built, defended, and renewed by each generation. If you walk today among the ruins of the Agora, the stones still whisper the same questions. What is justice? What is freedom? How should we live together? The answers shift with time, but the questions endure. Democracy is not a monument, it is a conversation, one that began in Athens more than 2,500 years ago and continues in every voice that dares to speak. The story of Athens is not a tale of eternal glory. It is a story of struggle, imperfection, and resilience. Its citizens made mistakes, turned on each other, and fell into arrogance. But they also dreamed, debated, and rebuilt. They proved that even in failure, the pursuit of freedom is worth every cost. When the sun sets over the Acropolis, the marble turns to gold. The columns of the Parthenon, cracked and broken, still stand as witnesses to the birth of an idea that refused to die. And that idea, that every voice matters, remains one of humanity's greatest gifts to itself.
If there is one truth the story of Athens reveals, it is that ideas outlive empires. Marble can crumble, armies can fall, but a thought, once spoken, once believed, travels through centuries like a spark carried by the wind. And the spark that ignited on the Pnyx Hill in Athens did not fade. It drifted across oceans and ages, lighting minds that never saw the Aegean, shaping nations that never knew the Parthenon's shadow. But before democracy became an ideal carved into human consciousness, it had to survive its own contradictions. For centuries, the word demokratia itself carried both admiration and suspicion. To many ancient thinkers, democracy meant the rule of the mob, a system where passion could overpower reason, where the crowd might destroy what it sought to protect. Even in Athens' Golden Age, philosophers argued fiercely about its dangers and its worth. Among them was Plato, the student of Socrates, who watched his teacher condemned to death by a democratic court. To him, that moment proved that democracy, for all its promises, could descend into injustice when guided by ignorance rather than wisdom. In his Republic, he painted a vision of a state ruled not by the many, but by the few who understood truth, the philosopher kings. Plato feared that when every voice held equal weight, the loudest would prevail, not the wisest. Democracy, he wrote, is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, dispensing equality to equals and unequals alike. And yet his own student, Aristotle, took a different view. He did not idealize democracy, but neither did he dismiss it. He classified it as one of 6 forms of government, 3 good, 3 corrupt. Monarchy could become tyranny, aristocracy could become oligarchy. Democracy, he said, could decline into demagoguery if the people sought pleasure over virtue.
But in its best form, when citizens governed for the common good rather than self-interest, democracy was a noble and just system. Aristotle called it politeia, the rule of the many guided by law. His analysis, written over 2 millennia ago, still reads like a mirror of modern politics. These debates among philosophers did not merely belong to ivory towers. They reflected the living tension within the city itself. For democracy demanded constant vigilance. Every citizen, from the farmer to the merchant, carried a fragment of the city's fate in his hands. Athens had no standing army of bureaucrats, no permanent rulers. The system depended entirely on participation, on men showing up, thinking deeply, speaking honestly. When they did, the city flourished. When they did not, it faltered. And so, democracy became not just a government, but a moral discipline, a daily act of balance between self and society. To vote without knowledge, to speak without reflection, was to betray the polis. The Athenians knew this, and they feared the decay of civic virtue even more than invasion. In their tragedies and comedies, they mocked their own follies, warning themselves never to let pride or laziness destroy what courage had built. Still, history moves in cycles. By the time of Alexander the Great, the independence of the Greek city-states had faded. After his death, his empire fragmented into kingdoms ruled by his generals. Yet the language of Athens, its art and ideas, spread across the known world, from Egypt to India. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon became centers of learning, carrying the Athenian torch of reason even under monarchs' crowns. The democratic experiment had ended at home, but its essence, curiosity, dialogue, and civic thought had gone global. Centuries passed, Rome rose and fell, empires shifted like tides. But through it all, scholars preserved the words of Solon, Cleisthenes, Pericles, Plato, and Aristotle. In dusty libraries and hidden monasteries, monks copied their texts by candlelight, not always understanding their significance, but feeling that something within those lines mattered. They were keeping a seed alive, waiting for another spring. That spring would come more than 1,000 years later, in Europe's Renaissance. As ancient manuscripts resurfaced, thinkers rediscovered Athens and its daring belief in human potential. The Renaissance humanists saw in the Athenians a mirror of themselves, a people who celebrated knowledge, art, and reason. Painters depicted the philosophers in grand halls of marble. Poets invoked their names as symbols of enlightenment. And once again, people began to ask dangerous questions. Should power belong to kings or to the people? By the 17th and 18th centuries, those questions ignited revolutions. In England, thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes argued about the nature of authority and consent. Locke, drawing indirectly from Athenian principles, declared that governments existed only by the will of the governed, that liberty was a natural right. Across the Channel, Montesquieu admired Athens but feared its instability, proposing the separation of powers as a safeguard against tyranny. Rousseau, in turn, dreamed of a social contract where citizens, united by common purpose, would rule themselves directly, an echo of the Pnyx reborn in print. And then, in 1776, across the Atlantic, a new experiment began. The founders of the United States, steeped in Greek philosophy, built a republic that borrowed from Athens' assembly and Rome's Senate alike. They admired Athens' faith in the citizen, even as they feared its volatility. Democracy, said James Madison, is the most vile form of government, but he added that the people's voice must always remain the foundation of any republic. The architects of modern democracy understood what the Athenians had learned long ago. Freedom must be balanced by wisdom, liberty by law. The French Revolution followed soon after, invoking the name of Athens openly. In the chaos of revolution, crowds chanted for equality, for reason, for the sovereignty of the people. But as in Athens, passion turned to violence, and freedom gave birth to terror. The guillotine replaced the sword, yet the question remained the same. Can liberty survive without virtue? History seemed to repeat itself, reminding every age that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be nurtured by conscience. By the 19th century, as industrialization transformed society, the idea of democracy expanded. The Athenian model had been exclusive, limited to a fraction of its population. But now, voices long silenced began to rise. The poor, the enslaved, and women all demanded the same rights once reserved for Athenian men. Each movement echoed the same ancient call: let every person be counted. It was not an easy journey. Blood was shed, nations torn apart. Yet, piece by piece, humanity built upon Athens' fragile foundation. The right to vote, to speak, to assemble, these were not gifts, but victories, earned through centuries of struggle. Every protest march, every rally, every whisper of dissent carried the same spirit that once gathered beneath the Athenian sky. Even in our modern world, the shadow of Athens lingers. Parliaments, congresses, and senates across continents trace their lineage, whether knowingly or not, to that first assembly. The architecture of our institutions, with their columns and domes, is a visual homage to Greek ideals. The words we use, politics, democracy, philosophy, are gifts of their language. But beyond the words and structures lies something more profound: a belief in human agency. Athens taught us that freedom is not about perfection, but participation. It is not about being right, but about being willing to listen, argue, and decide together. The Athenians knew that collective decision-making was slow, often frustrating, sometimes irrational. But they also knew that the alternative, tyranny, was far worse. They chose the harder path because they believed it was the only one worthy of dignity. If one listens closely, modern life still echoes their debates. The questions that filled the agora, about justice, equality, truth, and leadership, have never vanished. They resurface in every election, every protest, every conversation about power. We are all, in some way, Athenians, still wrestling with the same fragile miracle of self-government. In a sense, the story of Athenian democracy is the story of humanity's adolescence. It is the tale of a civilization learning to trust itself, to govern by conscience rather than fear. Like all youth, it made mistakes. It was arrogant, impulsive, and at times self-destructive. But it also dreamed bravely, dared to think differently, and laid the foundation for the adult world that would follow. And perhaps that is what makes Athens eternal. Not its temples or its victories, but its willingness to question its own existence. It never stopped asking, what does it mean to be free? Who deserves a voice? What is the price of justice? Those questions are the heartbeat of democracy, and they began here in the dust of a small city by the sea. When you stand on the Acropolis at twilight, looking down at the ruins of the Agora, it is easy to imagine the echoes of those ancient voices. The laughter, the arguments, the thunder of applause when a decision was made. The air itself seems to hum with memory. Time has taken the stones, but not the spirit. The birth of democracy in ancient Athens was not a single event. It was a dialogue between generations, a story still being written. Every era adds its own chapter, each one asking whether we have lived up to the promise first made beneath that bright Attic sky.
As centuries turned, and as the dust of empires settled into the earth, the spirit of Athens continued to move silently through time, an unseen current shaping human thought. The city that once ruled the waves of the Aegean now ruled the seas of the mind. Though its walls fell, its words endured. The idea of democracy had escaped its birthplace, becoming too vast to belong to one people alone. Every age since then has wrestled with the same paradox that Athens first revealed, that freedom demands restraint, that equality must coexist with order, that truth requires courage. These are not lessons of stone, they are lessons of the human heart. And while we may no longer gather on the Pnyx Hill, the questions once debated there still echo in our parliaments, in our classrooms, in the quiet chambers of conscience. Athens did not give the world a perfect system, it gave us a mirror. In that mirror, humanity can see both its highest hopes and its most dangerous temptations. The Athenians believed that the voice of the people could guide justice, but they also learned how easily that voice could be swayed by fear, greed, or pride. They learned that democracy could fall, not because of invasion, but because of apathy, because citizens stopped caring, stopped showing up, stopped believing their participation mattered. That is the eternal warning hidden within the Athenian story.
Democracy dies not with a bang, but with silence. And yet, when silence falls, it can be broken. That too was Athens' gift. Again and again, when power concentrated in the hands of the few, somewhere, often unexpectedly, the voice of the many rose again. From the Roman tribunes defending the rights of commoners, to the medieval guilds demanding representation, to the reformers of modern nations calling for suffrage, the flame has never gone out completely. It flickers, it fades, but it always returns. The Athenians might never have imagined how far their idea would travel. They lived in a world of slaves and city-states, unaware that one day continents would debate their philosophy. But they did imagine something greater than themselves, that reason, dialogue, and justice were not gifts from gods, but powers born within human nature itself. They believed that every man could be both ruler and ruled, that self-governance began with self-knowledge. Perhaps that was why philosophy and democracy were twins in Athens. Both began with the same act of humility, the acknowledgement that no one has all the answers, and that truth must be sought together. Socrates questioned so that others might think. The assembly debated so that all might decide. The philosopher and the citizen were not opposites. They were two sides of the same Athenian soul. When later thinkers like Aristotle wrote that man is by nature a political animal, he did not mean politics in the narrow sense of elections or offices. He meant that to live fully as human beings, we must live among others, speaking, reasoning, striving for the good of the whole. To withdraw from that was not peace, but exile. In this way, the Athenian experiment was not just political, it was deeply spiritual. It taught that the self and the community are reflections of each other, that freedom is empty without virtue, and that the destiny of one is bound to the destiny of all. Their festivals, their tragedies, even their architecture spoke of harmony, between mind and matter, between individual and society, between mortal life and eternal values. And yet, like all human endeavors, their harmony was imperfect. Athens enslaved others, even as it spoke of freedom. It silenced women, even as it praised wisdom. It conquered neighbors, even as it claimed justice. Its greatness lay not in purity, but in persistence, in its refusal to stop questioning, to stop evolving. Democracy, they taught, is not a temple to be preserved, but a fire to be tended. That fire spread far beyond the Mediterranean. In the centuries of exploration, when Europe crossed the seas and new worlds were discovered, the words of Athens returned again, this time to challenge kings and empires. The people who declared independence in America, who demanded liberty in France, who sought self-rule in colonies from India to Africa, all drew upon the same ancient promise, that no one is born to rule and no one is born to serve. Every person possesses dignity, and with dignity comes voice. But even now, in the modern age, democracy remains as fragile as it was on the Pnyx. It depends not on constitutions or institutions alone, but on the unseen thread of trust that binds citizens together. When that thread frays, when truth becomes negotiable, when division replaces dialogue, the system weakens, just as it did in Athens long ago. The lessons of history whisper their warning. Freedom without wisdom can destroy itself. Still, there is hope, for democracy is not a relic, it is a rhythm, a heartbeat that adapts to every age. It has survived plagues, wars, empires, and revolutions. It has been reborn in villages and cities, in the voices of reformers, in the pens of poets, in the protests of those who refuse to be silenced. Each time it is reborn, it carries within it the memory of Athens, the first daring attempt to turn equality from a dream into a law. Perhaps the true legacy of Athens lies not in what it achieved, but in what it began. It showed that history could be shaped by discussion rather than decree, that leadership could come from persuasion rather than power. It proved that a city could govern itself not by fear, but reason. And in doing so, it changed forever how humanity would imagine itself. Standing today among the ruins of the Acropolis, it is easy to feel small, to see those stones and think that the glory of the past has vanished. But if you listen closely, beyond the tourist chatter and the wind, you might hear something older, the echo of voices debating, questioning, dreaming. They are the voices of citizens long gone, but their spirit is not. It lives in every person who still believes in dialogue, in fairness, in the simple yet profound idea that we are all responsible for the world we share. Athens taught us that power is a circle. It returns, always, to those who care enough to hold it with integrity. It belongs not to the loudest, nor to the richest, but to those who stand, speak, and serve. That is what it meant in its truest sense to be a citizen. Not to obey blindly, but to think boldly. Not to rule others, but to govern oneself. And perhaps that is the final truth of democracy. It is not only a system of government, it is a way of living with others. It is an art that must be practiced daily with patience, humility, and faith in the possibility of goodness. It is not a gift handed down from the gods of Olympus, but a creation of humanity's own imperfect hands, a creation worth protecting. So the next time you see the word democracy, remember the place where it began. Remember the rocky hills of Attica, the hum of debate in the agora, the marble gleam of the Parthenon under the rising sun. Remember the farmers who left their fields to vote, the craftsmen who argued in the assembly, the philosophers who questioned the meaning of justice. Remember that their story is not distant, it is yours. For every time you speak, vote, protest, or dream of a fairer world, you are continuing what they began. The birth of democracy in ancient Athens was more than a moment in history. It was a revelation of human potential. It showed that even in imperfection, people can rise above fear, can build something together that endures beyond any single life. It was, and remains, a testament to the power of the human spirit to seek truth and equality no matter the cost. And so, the story of Athens ends as it began, with a question whispered across time. What will you do with your freedom? Because the story of democracy does not belong to the past. It is being written still, by us, by you, by every generation that dares to believe that humanity, in all its flaws, can govern itself with wisdom and compassion. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.